Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I'm going to be doing my March wrap up and telling you about all the things that I read in the month of March. So, I had a weirdly good reading month in March. I read 20 books, 4 of which were for work, I work in publishing, and the other 16 I can tell you about today. I don't really know how I ended up reading so much in March. I was really busy in March, and in my head, whenever I'm really busy, I read less. But actually, I think when I'm really busy, I read just as much, if not more. But I end up reading shorter books because I feel like they're less overwhelming if I'm busy at work. So I think that's why I ended up reading so much this month. So I didn't end up reading some of the longer books that were on my March TBR, like The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters or Jonathan Strange and Miss Norrell, which I will get to at some point later in this year when I can give it a bit more time. But I did end up reading quite a lot of books. So let's get into them, and as usual I will start off with the classics. So this month I reread The Professor by Charlotte Bronte. This was a reread that I was doing as part of Marissa from Blatantly Bookish's Bronte project, where we're reading / rereading books by the Brontes for the whole year. This was a weird read. I don't love The Professor. I think it is definitely the weakest Bronte novel, and I think you can tell that it was Charlotte Bronte's first novel, that she hadn't quite honed her craft yet. And I think especially reading The Professor directly after Villette, I feel like all of the themes that Charlotte Bronte was trying to explore in The Professor, she explores better in Villette. So I didn't love it, but it was quite interesting to reread, especially as I think it's the only Bronte novel that I had read once before this month. So The Professor follows the story of a young man who, after he kind of fails to make a career for himself working in the industrial world alongside his brother, he moves abroad to Belgium, where he becomes a teacher in a school, and we follow his work in this school and also his relationship with two very different women. I think the main issue I have with The Professor, as I already said, is that I just think it's like a practice run for Villette. It's not necessarily that it's like exactly the same, but there are quite a few kind of characters that you can see parallels between, and I think a lot of the themes to do with kind of loneliness and being away from home and kind of cultural difference. I think all of that stuff is just done much better in Villette. So The Professor is a kind of interesting read, but it just doesn't really wow me in the way that the other 3 novels of Charlotte Bronte do. Another Victorian thing I read this month was You Never Can Tell by George Bernard Shaw. This is a late Victorian play which I really enjoyed, and I partly picked up something by George Bernard Shaw this month because the Irish Readathon was happening and I wanted to read something by one of my favourite Irish Victorian authors. I really loved You Never Can Tell. It was just such a delightful reading experience, and I think because the plays of George Bernard Shaw's that I've read before have been his like darker, more gritty, more depressing ones, actually this was a real surprise to me because it's just like a really heartwarming comedy that's just funny and silly and just entirely enjoyable. So You Never Can Tell is about this family, a mother and 3 children, and they come back to England after they've been abroad for years, partly in order to find their father, who they know has separated from their mother many years ago, and they don't really remember him at all. So they come back to England, and obviously they meet their father like by accident really early on, and there's a lot of kind of complicated family politics, and as often in George Bernard Shaw there's a lot about kind of gender power dynamics in the late Victorian period, and it's just a really enjoyable read. I think one of the things I loved about it most was the dialogue and the kind of well-developed characters and how wonderfully they speak. 2 of the children are twins who are like 18, 17 years old, and they're just really silly, and I just really enjoy the way they speak to each other. It's just great fun and really enjoyable. They just kind of say things that they're not supposed to say and kind of break all the social codes of the Victorian period, but in a really like charming, fun way. So really good read. Highly recommend it. Moving on to some 20th century classics. This month I listened to Partners in Crime by Agatha Christie. This is one of her Tommy and Tuppence books, and it is a short story collection. So this is the second in the Tommy and Tuppence series. I read The Secret Adversary a year or two ago, and I really enjoyed this one. This is probably one of my favourite Agatha Christie's actually. It's a short story collection and it is very much in Sherlock Holmes style. Like there's a lot of little mysteries, and some of the mysteries are more serious, kind of murder mystery things, but a lot of the mysteries are just like something weird's happened and we're trying to find out what. I think there are two things that I've really loved about this collection. I think one is just the relationship between Tommy and Tuppence is so fun, and they're both such good characters, and Tuppence especially I really like, and I like the fact that she is a, you know, young woman in her early 20s and everyone underestimates her because she's pretty. They think that she can't be a good detective, but actually she just like wows them all because she's incredibly intelligent, and I really like it when she's the one that solves the crime. But I like her relationship with Tommy a lot as well, and I think that's really good fun. And then the other thing that I really love about Partners in Crime, which just makes it so fun to read, is that both Tommy and Tuppence as characters are obsessed with detective stories and mysteries, so they make a lot of like references and in-jokes to other fictional detectives, including lots of Sherlock Holmes references, but also including like Poirot references, which I really enjoy because that means that within the like fictional world of Tommy and Tuppence, Agatha Christie's novels about Poirot also exist within that world, and so they're kind of like talking about reading Poirot stories and like taking the mick out of Poirot in their own stories, even though that's another Agatha Christie character. That's just so meta and fills me with such delight. So yeah, highly recommend that. Agatha Christie is great. Another thing I listened to on audiobook this month was The Belgian by Sylvia Plath, which I really enjoyed. This was another favourite of the month for me. I'm glad I finally got to it because I've been meaning to read it for ages. This is an American classic from the 1960s, which tells the story of a young woman. She is 19 years old, and while at university in the US, she kind of suffers from a sort of nervous breakdown, and it's about her experience with mental health and with kind of mental health institutions in the US at this time. It's an incredibly powerful novel. I thought the way it looked at kind of mental health and depression and the way society at this point in time was treating people with such illnesses, I thought was brilliantly explored and really fascinating. But it's also exceptionally beautifully written. Like the writing is just stunning, and I'm really glad I listened to an audiobook actually, because I feel like there's something about listening to an audiobook where you just take in that intensely beautiful writing even more. It was a really powerful read, very stunning and just fantastic. I'm so glad I finally got to it. I will say, just as a like a warning, if you read it, there is quite a lot of casual racism in it, which I shouldn't really be that surprised about considering it's a book from the 1960s, but some of it is quite, like some of it took me aback quite a lot. I always kind of expect to encounter problematic things much more in 19th century literature, and whenever I encounter them in 20th century literature, even though I really shouldn't be surprised, it always like takes me aback slightly more, so I did just want to mention that. Another book I read in March was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is a Colombian novel and one that I am really glad that I read. This was a weird read. I sort of knew a little bit about it, but somehow it still really wasn't what I was expecting. It basically tells the story of this town and this particular family living in this town over 100 years, following it down through the generations. All of the people that they meet, everything that happens, including kind of experiences during civil war and time of turmoil in the country. I found it really interesting. There are bits of it that I loved. It's beautifully written and it's really intriguing, and there are kind of elements of magic realism and people living, you know, far longer than they should and that kind of thing, which I found very interesting to read about. But I feel like the main feeling that I took away from this book was one of slight confusion. There's quite a lot of it, which I just found quite hard to follow. I think one of the main things that I really struggle with is that a lot of the characters have the same name, and the reasons why is explained, and they're all kind of named after previous people in the family, but it did mean that I just found it really hard to tell all the characters apart. And I found that throughout the book I wasn't really feeling engaged with any of the characters apart from Ursula, who is the kind of matriarch figure who I did really like, but I felt like every other character I didn't really get a grip on them because of the name thing, but also because there are a lot of characters and I just felt like it was a little bit confused. So I think there are things that I really liked about this, but I didn't love it. I enjoyed it, but I feel like my main response to it was one of confusion. One thing I did find really interesting reading it actually is that I read a book earlier this year called Primeval and Other Times by Olga Tokarczuk, which I read at the time and quite enjoyed, but I feel like I understand this book much more, having read 100 Years of Solitude, because I feel like it's very much inspired by it. And that's quite interesting because obviously I read this quite recently before I read this, but I feel like I understand this book more having read this. But anyway, this month I also read Carte and Quither, which is the first one in the Dalemark Quartet by Diana Wynne-Jones. This is a children's book that I read in part for middle grade March. I really enjoyed this one. I really like Diana Wynne-Jones. I've read quite a lot of her books and I'm kind of working my way through them, but I feel like this was one of my favourites so far. This is a fantasy series, the first one in a quartet, and it follows this family who are travelling musicians and they live in this world that is kind of divided into the north and the south, and one of these kingdoms is much more strict and tyrannical and repressive than the other, and hardly anyone moves between the two kingdoms except for musicians who travel. So the musicians are often the ones who kind of take people from place to place and pass news between these two realms. And we're following this family, 2 parents and 3 children, plus a teenager who is on the road with them, travelling from place to place, and what happens when they get caught up in all the kind of complicated politics of the realm. And there's also some like magic, and the magic is all tied up with music, which I really enjoy. So this was a really good fun read. There are a lot of things that I really liked about this. I felt like the world building was really complicated and interesting, and I've got a really good sense of this place that makes me really excited to carry on with the series. I thought the characterization was really good, and the kind of coming of age stuff for the younger children was well done, and I really liked all the kind of kingdom politics of this. I also really loved the way music is used in this and the kind of connections between magic and music. I really like it when books explore music, and I feel like magical music and musical magic is something that I really enjoy whenever it comes up in literature. The one thing I will say about the particular edition of this is that this section at the back, like the last 100 pages, is a kind of glossary and kind of guidebook about the world, which contains a lot of spoilers, so I didn't read very much of it. I got to like the first page and was like, oh, I haven't encountered this yet, definitely not going to read on with, but I did find that slightly annoying to have a very spoilery thing in the back of the first book in the series. Anyway, I'm very excited to read on with the rest of the series. Moving on to some historical fiction. This month I read This Is Happiness by Niall Williams. This is a novel set in the 1950s in Ireland and was another of my picks for the Irish Readathon, and it's basically looking at this young boy, he's sort of maybe 16, 17, and his relationship with an elderly man who comes as a lodger to his grandparents who he lives with in order to electrify the town. He is there to bring electricity to this small rural town in Ireland. He's putting up poles and just putting everything on the grid and adding electricity, and our main character kind of develops a friendship with this man, Christy, and learns about Christy's kind of great love affair from the past with a woman who happens to still live nearby. I feel like on paper this book should have been a book that I absolutely love. I very much enjoy a like over-the-shoulder narrative where we're hearing the story from one character's perspective, but it's actually more about another character, which I feel like there's definitely a lot of with here, it being, you know, narrated by this young boy, but it's really much more, I think, a book about Christy. I also thought the exploration of like Ireland in the 1950s and bringing electricity to this place really interesting. I thought that was well done, and all the kind of cultural and social stuff around all of that was fascinating. I also really liked the relationship between the young boy and the old man. I thought that was really enjoyable, but I just didn't love this book. And I was trying to work out why, because I feel like both This Is Happiness and History of Rain, which is the other book by Niall Williams I've read, both of them I really enjoyed. Both of them I really liked the premise and the writing and the characters, but they didn't quite land for me, and they were both very much like 3.5, 4-star reads, not 5-star reads. But I felt like when I thought about them and had a description of them in my head, they should have been 5-star reads. And I think what it is for the other one and also for This Is Happiness is that not enough happens in this book for me, and I think it's just a little bit too literary for me. I feel like if this novel had been 100 pages shorter with all the same content, I would have liked it more, because I feel like the characterization and the relationships were really good, and the themes this book is exploring were great, but I feel like it doesn't have that much of a plot, or at least the plot that it has is too extended in order to give more time to like description and, you know, kind of local colour and interest. And actually I feel like this book didn't quite warrant all the space it took up because I just don't think enough happened, and I think I would have liked a little bit more plot. So I think that's just a personal taste thing of maybe Niall Williams is just a little bit too literary for me as a writer, but there was a lot that I did really enjoy in this book. So I feel like if you are slightly more of a fan of books with less plot and slightly more literary fiction, then I feel like maybe you'll get on with Niall Williams a little bit more than I did, but it just wasn't quite there for me, but it was still a really interesting read. Then the other two historical fiction books that I read this month were A Treacherous Country by K.M. Krumink and Hinton by Mark Blacklock. I'm not going to talk about either of these books in very much detail today because I made a separate video reviewing both of these books together, as they are two books that are on the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, which I'm currently reading along with, but I will talk about them a little bit here. So Hinton by Mark Blacklock is a book following a kind of fictionalised account of the life of real-life Victorian mathematician Howard Hinton. And this novel has a complicated structure and moves around a lot in time and form. I didn't love Hinton. It was, again, actually a little bit too literary for me, though it is a step more literary, I would say, than This Is Happiness. I found it interesting, but I felt like I couldn't fully invest with and engage with the characters just because the kind of form and the writing kind of got in the way a little bit for me. But I much more preferred A Treacherous Country, which I really enjoyed. I really got on with this one, and it tells the story of a young man called Gabriel Fox who travels from England to Australia kind of to track down this woman who is a kind of family member of a connection of his, and while he's trying to find her, he kind of gets distracted by everything else that's going on, meets a lot of new people, and ends up learning much more about himself and his family and his relationship with his family back home. I really enjoyed the kind of adventure he goes on and learning much more about this character and his relationship with his family. It's a really engaging, interesting read, and I would definitely recommend it. Another novel I read in March was Lena, Forstan by John McGregor. This is a review copy which the publishers kindly sent me. This comes out in April and it was such a wonderful read. I love John McGregor so much, just one of my absolute favourite authors. This novel tells the story of a man and his wife. The man at the very beginning of the novel is involved in some kind of accident in the Antarctic where he's on an expedition, and then we follow his recovery after that accident and his relationship with his wife and how this affects his wife. And basically the novel is looking at this aftermath of the expedition and what went wrong, and everything that follows. It's incredibly powerful and moving. It's beautifully written, and I think just a wonderful read. I just love John McGregor's writing so much. I feel like he is very good at getting to the heart of people and characters and just really exploring a character to the full and really getting in their head. And it's interesting because I've said about two other books in this video, both Hinton and This Is Happiness, that they're a bit too literary for me, and I feel like John McGregor is the most literary author who I love. I don't know why I love his books so much, because when I think about them they should be too literary for my taste. I just think he's got that wonderful way with words and that wonderful way with characterization that he can make what should be a kind of very literary book really accessible, really beautiful, really poignant, and where even if not very much happens in his novels, I feel like there's always a big event that has such an impact and we're kind of following the ripples of that event in a way that I just feel like even if there isn't a lot of plot throughout his novels, there's always one moment that has enough plot to sustain the whole book for me. And I just think his books are amazing, and this is so great, and you should all read it. Another of my favourite reads in March was Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. I've been meaning to get to this for ages, and I finally read it, and I absolutely loved it. It was very good and very much up my street. So this is a novel which you've probably heard tons about by now. It's set in Scotland, and we're following a young woman who has lived a slightly odd and kind of very routine-based life for many years. She goes to work, she does her day job, then every weekend she goes home, gets incredibly drunk on vodka on her own in order to make the weekend go faster. We know that she has a bad relationship with her mother, and we know that she is struggling, And the book basically starts off when a colleague of hers and her get caught up in helping a man who has fallen over in the street. And through this incident, her and her colleague kind of become friends, and it's about their friendship. And Eleanor kind of coming to terms with her life more and coming to understand herself more. I really, really enjoyed this. I thought it was so good and just so entirely the kind of book I like. It's a really wonderful book about a person kind of coming to understand themselves more. I think it's a brilliant book about friendship, and I love very much that the focus in this novel was on friendship. And I really just like Eleanor's character a lot. I think that she felt very believable to me, and I liked that, like, even at the times when Eleanor is an unpleasant character and is, you know, judgmental of other people, she also is kind of judges herself for being judgmental and knows that this is her mother's influence on her. This is not who she really wants to be, but the upbringing she has had and the life she has had has made her have certain opinions that she kind of doesn't want to have anymore and that she doesn't quite know how to get rid of. It really got to the heart of her as a character, and she felt very believable to me. So I really, really loved this one. Highly, highly recommend it. I also read In Case You Missed It by Lindsay Kelk. Lindsay Kelk is a commercial women's fiction writer who I've been meaning to read something by for ages, and I really enjoyed In Case You Missed It. This is a story about a woman who comes back to the UK after she's been working abroad for several years, and she is reconnecting with everyone who she used to know, and she, you know, gets a new phone, sends her new number to everyone in her old contacts book, which she doesn't realise includes her ex-boyfriend who she hasn't seen for several years, and they kind of meet up again and reconnect. And we start to follow their relationship, but both of them have changed a little bit over time, and especially the main character's friends are a little bit sceptical of their relationship, and everything kind of goes on from there. It's a really good, fun rom-com that I really enjoyed. I felt like the female friendships and all the kind of friend characters around our main character were really well done. I also enjoyed the character's complicated relationships with her parents, who she ends up moving back in with, thinking they'll be really glad to see her and they really don't want her there, because they're like rekindling their marriage, and I just found that stuff quite fun too. So a really good read and definitely a good fun rom-com to pick up. I also read Never Greener by Ruth Jones. This is another commercial women's fiction novel, and we're following an actress called Kate who at the beginning of the book is married. She has a young daughter, and inadvertently at an event that she is doing, she meets a man who 17 years ago she had an affair with when she was single and 22 and he was married and 37. And they end up rekindling this affair, though he is still married and she is now married as well. And it's about kind of that relationship and the fallout from that and how it affects everyone else around them. I think I really liked this novel, but I'm not completely sure. I kind of hated so many of the characters. There is a character called Hetty who is the best friend of Kate's husband, who I really liked, and her storyline I really enjoyed, and her friendship with Kate's husband Matt I liked, and Matt was quite a good character. Those two I quite liked as characters, but Kate and Callum, the two central characters, I kind of hated both of them, and I was so angry with them so much at the time, but I also feel like that was sort of the point, and I quite liked that that was the point. In general, I'm not someone who massively loves novels that focus on affairs. That's not in general a theme that I love reading about, but I felt like this was done very well. So in that sense, I did really enjoy this one. And I've also heard amazing things about Us Three, which is Ruth Jones's next novel, so I'm looking forward to reading that too. Another women's fiction novel I read in March was The Brightest Star in the Sky by Marianne Keyes. This I listened to on audiobook, and it was another one of my picks for the Irish Readathon. Marianne Keyes is one of the kind of biggest Irish commercial women's fiction writers, and I've been meaning to read something by her for ages, and I really enjoyed this one. It kind of wasn't what I expected, but I also really liked it. It has quite an unusual narrative style, which I don't think all of Marianne Keyes' books do, where the narrator is a kind of spirit sort of thing, and what exactly doesn't become clear till quite far on to the novel, but this spirit thing is in this block of flats, kind of looking in on the lives of all of the different people that live in this block of flats, and as this spirit moves around over the course of a few months, we learn more about the characters, all of whom are kind of connected together by living in this block of flats, and we follow all of their different storylines. And there's a lot of really really interesting themes going on. There's a lot about friendship and romantic relationships, about mental health and physical illness, and I really enjoyed all of those themes and how they all came together, and I feel like the central relationships felt very real, so I really enjoyed this, and yeah, definitely looking forward to reading more by Marianne Keyes in the future. Finally, I also read 2 crime books this month. The first I read was No Way Out by Cara Hunter. This is a sort of police procedural crime mystery, and we're following a few different detectives and various other characters as they're investigating what happened in this house fire. It happened between Christmas and New Year, and they find the bodies of the 2 children in the family, but not the bodies of the parents, and so they don't know where the parents went and what exactly happened. And basically we're following the fallout from that and everyone trying to solve this mystery and find out exactly what happened and where the parents have gone. It's a really compelling and fast-moving mystery that I really enjoyed. I found it really gripping. One of those books I could just fly through. I also really enjoyed the use of like mixed media and lots of different voices. We see from quite a lot of different perspectives, and there's also like lots of reports and interview transcripts and all that kind of thing, which is something that I really enjoy in a crime novel. So that was a really good fun read, and I'm looking forward to reading more by Cara Hunter in the future. And then finally, I also read The Chalk Pit by Ellie Griffiths. I've meaning to read something by Ellie Griffiths for ages, and I know I have started like well into the series, but I feel like there are so many that I just wanted to pick one and begin. And we're following a detective, DCI Nelson, and an archaeologist, Dr. Ruth Galloway, who often gets involved in criminal cases when there's like archaeological evidence to uncover, or when she ends up uncovering archaeological evidence that might have something to do with a case. And the novel begins when human bones are uncovered in an network of underground tunnels beneath Norwich, and meanwhile DCI Nelson is investigating someone's disappearance, and everything is kind of going on from there, and we follow what happens as people try and solve this mystery with a bit of a thriller ending as well. This was an enjoyable read. The characterization was really good, and the mystery I thought was quite compelling as well. I do think of the 2 I preferred Cara Hunter, and Cara Hunter's probably an author I'm more excited to read more by in the future, but it was an interesting read and one that I really enjoyed. And that is all. Those are the books that I read in March. I'm sorry if this video has been really long. I don't know how I managed to read quite that much in March. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.